Hi everyone, welcome back to So Arizona. I'm Kara and today we are continuing on to the third part of our tomato growing series. Today we're talking about the difference between determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, which refers to the growth habit of the plant as well as the timing and the amount of fruit production you can expect. Each type has unique characteristics such as when and how much of a harvest you can expect, how much maintenance and support the plant needs, and even where you can grow them. So let's explore the differences and pros and cons right now. Let's begin with determinate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes are sometimes called bush or patio style tomatoes. They can grow to a size of 3 to 4 feet and then stop. But this is not set in stone. There can be dwarf tomatoes that are about 12 inches tall, and then there can be bush or patio type tomatoes that can be 3 to 4 feet at a maximum height. When the fruit of determinate plants ripen, you can expect it to do so all at once. Let's start with the pros of determinate tomatoes. The first one is harvest efficiency. Determinate tomatoes are perfect for gardeners who want to have the fruit all at once for preserving or canning. Determinate tomatoes will provide a concentrated fruit set, which means that they ripen all at once, and so it's perfect for gardeners who are expecting a bulk harvest. The second one is space saving. Determinate tomatoes are very compact plants, and so they are perfect for patios, for containers, for raised beds, or even in-ground small spaces. Determinate tomato growth is self-limiting, and so they are perfect for all of those small spaces. The next pro is minimal pruning. Determinate tomatoes, as I said, limit their growth, so they will grow to their maximum height and then they kind of coast, which means you don't have to spend time at pruning or adding extra supports as their growth continues throughout the season. They're not going to take over the neighborhood like the indeterminate tomatoes will, and we'll talk about that very soon. The next one is limited support, which is related to minimal pruning, and that is because tomatoes that are determinate will limit their growth to under 4 feet, and that means that you don't need to continue adding support as that plant grows throughout the season like you do with indeterminate tomatoes. A tomato basket, a wooden garden stake, or even one of those green plastic stakes is going to be sufficient for the life of that plant to support it. I have grown the smaller dwarf varieties of determinate tomatoes, and you can actually get away without supporting them at all in that case. But if you have plants that are on the larger spectrum of the determinate size, then you can just use a basket or a garden stake, and that should be fine. All right, let's talk about the cons for growing determinate tomato plants. The first one is limited production window. Now this means that once determinate plants has that flush of ripe fruit, the plant is generally done. There are a few exceptions. I have had some determinate plants that will kind of offer up a tomato here and there, but for the most part, the main harvest is just finished. So if you want to have a constant supply of tomatoes throughout the warm growing season, you might want to go with an indeterminate tomato plant instead of a determinate tomato plant. Now this con has a silver lining for southern Arizona gardeners. Since we have 2 tomato growing windows, one in early spring and again in the fall, you can replant determinate style tomato plants and then have a second harvest in the late fall. So if you're planting your determinate tomato plants, say in December or January, and you set them out in February, you can expect a harvest in maybe April. And then once that harvest is finished, you can sow those seeds again inside and restart another determinate tomato plant again in August. So just because you have a small space, don't feel discouraged. You can plant determinate tomato plants and get a second crop. You'll just have to start with a brand new plant. The second con for growing determinate tomato plants is fruit overwhelm. Now this can be a pro if you're a gardener who wants that flush of fruit all at once so that you can preserve or can it how you like. It's more efficient to get that fruit ripened all at the same time. But if you're a gardener who is busy, maybe you work a lot of hours or you just have a lot of other responsibilities, you may want to have a slower harvest over time. And in that case, an indeterminate tomato plant that offers you a slower but more continuous harvest would be a better bet for you. Otherwise, you are going to have tomatoes ripen all at the same time and have them up to your ears, and you will have to figure out what to do with them so that they don't waste. The third con is a short production window. So if you are looking for tomatoes to put on salads or to eat fresh or for snacking, then a determinate tomato is probably not going to be the right fit for you. You're going to want to go with an indeterminate tomato plant that will give you fruit all season. For determinate tomato plants, they grow, they flower, they fruit, and they ripen all at once. So if you'll notice, like so many things in life, cons can be pros and pros can be cons. It just depends on what you're looking for. Determinate tomatoes are a great fit for some gardeners, and then for other gardeners, we may be looking for something a little bit different, and so we will want to look at indeterminate tomato plants coming up. As I said before, the small growth habit of determinate tomato plants makes them perfect for small spaces in urban gardens and in containers, but that does not mean you can't grow them out in ground or if you have a large garden space. I have grown determinate tomatoes out in my garden, which is a pretty large space, and it just means that you get more plants. So it just depends on what you're looking for and what your space requirements are. So don't limit yourself. If you feel like you want to have some of both, maybe grow some determinate tomatoes to have a harvest all at once or to be able to plant close together, but you can also throw in indeterminate tomato plants if you want to have a continuous harvest of fresh tomatoes all through the season, and then you get the best of both worlds. Speaking of indeterminate tomato plants, let's talk about their pros right now. Indeterminate tomato plants are sometimes called vine tomatoes. They can reach heights of 6 feet or more, and their growth will continue until they are killed by frost at the end of a season. During this wild period of growth, they can produce a continuous supply of fruit. Now, as I discussed in video 1 of this tomato growing series, tomato plants will set fruit at a certain temperature range, and that fruit will ripen under a certain temperature. And so just because they can continue growing all season does not necessarily mean that they will produce fruit constantly over the entire growing season. Sometimes there will be some ebb and flow to that. They may set fruit, and depending on the temperature, that fruit may be quicker or slower to ripen. It depends on your geographic location. But in general, indeterminate tomato plants are capable of producing a continuous supply of fruit all season long. If you want more about that temperature range information, see video 1. I will link that right here. So let's talk about the pros of indeterminate tomato plants, and then we'll move on to the cons. The first pro for growing indeterminate tomato plants is something that we've already touched on several times, and that is a continuous harvest. If the temperatures are right, then indeterminate tomato plants can produce fruit all season long until they're frost killed. The second pro is the potential for higher yield. Since indeterminate tomato plants have the potential, depending on temperature, to produce all season long, you may be able to get more fruit from one plant than you could with a determinate. Of course, this is variety dependent. Some varieties are heavy producers and others are lighter producers, so that should play into your choice as well. The higher yields that are possible from indeterminate tomatoes is good news for gardeners who are looking for a steady supply of fresh tomatoes all season long, or for a slower harvest over time so that they have the opportunity to keep up and not drown in tomatoes because they're coming in all at once. Moving on to the cons of indeterminate tomato plants, the first one is space requirements. Indeterminate tomato plants need space to grow and spread out, and that's because they are going to grow continuously until killed by frost in the fall. You need to think about that when placing those itty bitty tomato seedlings, because they are not going to stay that way for long. They are going to start getting large and vining. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I have. You put a stake near the tomato plant or a tomato basket or some sort of a support structure, and you think that it's going to be sufficient for the whole season, only to find that halfway through the growing season, that tomato plant has surpassed the support structure and you need to come up with a different solution to support it for the remainder of the season. If you have a larger space and it's not an issue that the plant gets bigger or maybe gets a little wild, then that's fine. But if you're dealing with a smaller space that you are trying to grow other things in as well, a determinate tomato may be a better bet for you. The second con of growing indeterminate tomatoes is that that they will require regular maintenance. In some areas of the country or the world, gardeners will give the advice regularly that you need to remove all of the suckers on tomato plants and prune them and keep them neat and tidy, because they will divert energy from fruit production to supporting the foliage of the plant. And that can be true. However, in the desert, we have unique growing conditions. We have drying winds, high temperatures, and really harsh sunlight. Gardeners often use shade cloth to protect their tomatoes during the hottest parts of the summer. But if you leave some of that foliage intact, the plant can also protect itself from things like sun scald, which is a sunburn of the fruit, and just the harsh temperatures and UV in general. So I think that leaving some of the foliage can actually be good for the plant if you're growing in the desert. So what I do, because I don't have to worry about my space, is I generally let those tomato plants grow. I don't do a lot of pruning unless that tomato plant is being rude to its neighbor and starting to overtake the space. In addition to whether or not tomato plants are diverting their energy to fruit production versus supporting foliage, is that tomato plants do need good airflow to prevent powdery mildew. In places that get lots of regular rainfall all summer long, that deal with constant high humidity, that is an important thing to consider. We don't have high humidity all season long. We have a rainy season, which brings high humidity, so you may want to consider pruning during that time of the year. But in general, I have not had a problem with powdery mildew on my tomatoes. You have your unique growing conditions, you have your own unique space, so you need to decide for yourself whether to prune or not to prune. But just know, when you're choosing a tomato plant, if you choose an indeterminate tomato plant, it will have continual growth all season, and you're either going to have to prune or add additional support structures to keep that tomato plant playing well with others. The last con for indeterminate tomato plants that I want to talk about is a longer number of days to maturity. Now, if you recall from video 1, we talked about the importance in southern Arizona's unique growing season to choose tomato plants that have shorter number of days to maturity, because you basically have from February until about May or June to get those tomatoes from seedling to harvest, and then again from August until whenever they are frost killed. So we have 2 windows, but they're short. So choosing a tomato plant variety that has a shorter number of days to maturity is going to give you the best bet for getting a good harvest like you're expecting. Since indeterminate tomato plants will grow continuously throughout the season, they kind of take their time. And so it's important for you to look for plants that will mature more quickly than plants that will mature more slowly. When it comes to the growing environment, obviously, since they will grow continuously and get to a bigger size, it's easier to grow indeterminate tomato plants in larger spaces. That does not mean that you can't grow them in containers or that you can't grow them in smaller gardens. It just means that you're going to have to stay on top of the maintenance and on top of giving them support so that they don't fall over or block the light from other plants. To add more confusion to the mix, there is a third variety of tomato, and that is a semi-determinate tomato. And that means that their growth habit and their fruit production fall somewhere in between a determinate and an indeterminate. So they will usually produce fruits all at once, but then they'll also provide some fruit throughout the season, but just in a lighter amount than an indeterminate tomato would. I tried the Tidy Rose tomato, which is a small, petite type of beefsteak tomato. It doesn't produce those huge beefsteak tomatoes like you would think of, but it produces a much smaller, about the size of an apple, pink tomato beefsteak style. And I grow that, and it will produce a nice big flush all at once, but then I will also get a few more throughout the season, particularly as the temperatures start to cool in September or October. All right, so I hope that that gives you more information that you need to pick the kind of tomato that you want. If you want a continuous harvest for snacking or fresh eating, an indeterminate tomato might be right for you, particularly if you have a little bit bigger growing space. If you want to have a tomato that will stay small and compact because of your growing space, or if you want to harvest all at once so that you can do preserving and canning in a more efficient manner, then you may want to go with a determinate variety. Now you have 3 videos giving you you all of the terminology that you need for picking out the perfect tomato for you. Video 1 talked about the importance of temperature when it comes to flower development, fruit set, and tomato ripening. Video 2 talked about different types of tomatoes like hybrids versus GMOs versus heirloom versus open pollinated. And now you also know the difference in growth habits and fruit ripening, and that is determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes. So I think that you have all of the information that you need to be able to pick out the perfect tomato for your spot.